Welcome to Rejected Religion Patreon, Tier 2, The Groves of Orpheus. My guest this month is Dr. Sue Terry. Welcome, Sue.
Hello, Stephanie. Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here.
It is so good to have you back. You've recently passed your Viva and now hold the title of Doctor of Philosophy and English Literature from the University of Surrey. Congratulations to you.
Many thanks. Yes, long time, but I'm so pleased.
I bet you are so relieved and so happy that that's now behind you.
Yes, quite.
So the title of your dissertation is Occult Modernism and the Radical Reform of the Family, Female Empowerment in the Magical Fiction of Four Women Writers, 1890 to 1940, in which you write about Florence Farr, Mary Butts, Sylvia Townsend Warner, and P.L. Travers. Now, I have not yet had the pleasure of reading this. Hopefully, this will be made available soon so I can read it.
Oh, yes.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So, in the meantime, I'd love to talk to you today about this, and if you could share a little bit about it. Of course, we can't talk about everything, but hopefully we can talk a bit about it so that the listeners can learn more about these extremely interesting and influential women. So let's start with Florence Farr. In reading about Florence, this woman was a powerhouse.
Yeah.
She was an actress, a writer, a singer, a director, a feminist, an educator, leader of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I mean, it would be a better question to ask, what did she not do? Right?
Yes, right.
So could you talk a little bit about what you found out about her in your research?
With great pleasure. She was also an embroiderer, may I say.
Well, may add that to the list.
She worked with May Morris, William Morris's daughter, in producing marvelous textiles.
Oh, wow.
She needed a job, so that was one of the things by which she earned her living. However, yes, Florence Farr, a really interesting woman. As you say, she has so many different personae, really. And I think the one that sticks out most, that is the one that really underpins all her work and all her life, is that of magician and occultist. And her occultism underlay absolutely everything she did. And it emerges, I say, in her work as a sort of expression of being hidden in plain sight. Everything that she does relates back to it. And I think she was like a consummate feminist occult modernist. And, with her background in the Golden Dawn, really gave her the ability to kind of change things just by walking into a room. Things started to happen around her. And as a result of which she is, I'm very pleased to say, beginning to emerge now far more from kind of footnotes and anecdotes about her relationship with various, influential men of the artistic scene of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rumours of relationships and so on, and to being seen as a muse by authors like W.B. Yeats and George Bernard Shaw and various others. But she's now emerging into her own light, if you will. And this is particularly through her dramatic work. Her Egyptian plays that she wrote, The Beloved of Hathor and The Shrine of the Golden Hawk, are becoming much more well known and more discussed. And several productions have come into the public domain in the last 30 years, and they're still emerging through various kind of events and groups and things which I'm associated with myself, with my colleague, particularly Caroline Wise, who's done a great deal of work to bring Florence back into the limelight in her own specific way. But there is a growing interest in all of her work. It's becoming much more popular and literally understood. However, my focus in the thesis was from her literary work, her fiction, because Florence Farr also wrote fiction. She wrote particularly a novel called The Dancing Faun, which was kind of slanted at the general reader, specifically, I would say, towards a women's audience, because of the themes in which she explores marriage, relationships, and women's empowerment, as I say, and how they can kind of overcome various kind of restrictions that the married life, particularly in this establishment setting, put on women. And really, she analyzes marriage and relationships in a lot of her work, but in particular in The Dancing Faun, she does bring in her Golden Dawn philosophies. It underpins a lot of this, and it becomes an element, as I read it, of a kind of initiatory fiction for women, which I'll probably come back to shortly. Okay. But she's revealing really what is this toxic secrecy at the heart of the establishment and marriage. And it's quite a sophisticated analysis of the relationships and the abuses which can be found in these settings. It's kind of presented, if you will, as a sort of almost like a comedy of manners. There's a lot of crossovers with the sort of literary fiction and drama that we'd be familiar with, like Oscar Wilde, for example, whom she knew and was involved in productions of his work and so on. And that kind of high-mannered, amusing, bantering, witty conversationalism. But really, although that is present, because Florence Farr's actually got quite a great sense of humour, although those elements are present, she's also doing something very interesting, because Florence was one of the very first early adopters of the works of Ibsen and the new drama. And she brings into her discussions here the influences of Ibsen, holding up society to close analysis and pointing out the hypocrisies of marriage and the difficulties of the restrictions on women's life and so on. And she also, in this particular novel, I can read this as her involvement with a play by Shelley called The Cenci, or Century, because I don't know much of the Italian, I'm afraid. Both of these two novels, these two works of drama, interact with her literary vision in the novel to present some really shocking revelations about what truly goes on in society. And as I say, interwoven with all of this is her Golden Dawn teaching. And she's saying to women, we can use this. You can build in your psyche this kind of fortress of support for yourself, and you will be able to resist the kind of effects of this toxic secrecy and the manipulations in romantic love, relationships and marriage that comes your way. So I think this is also an early experiment in initiatory fiction, particularly for women. And obviously later on in the 30s, that strand is explored more by Dion Fortune. But I'm looking back a little bit earlier and how she helps women to understand the transformative nature of literature and so on for themselves. Because the story of The Dancing Faun is basically the story of George Travers. He's a fraudster, a conman, a cheat, and his relationship with two female central characters, Geraldine Fitzjustin, the daughter of society matriarch Lady Kirkdale, the Marchioness, and the late Marquis Lord Kirkdale, and Grace Lovell, a young woman who wants to return to acting but has been drawn into this exploitative criminal marriage with him. Before, Grace is unable to throw off his influence and achieve some element of personal liberation. And Geraldine is also attracted to Travers, he's a very attractive man, when he's introduced to the family through her brother. And for a couple of months, she believes she's in love. But when Travers' duplicity is revealed, she takes the ultimate revenge by shooting Travers dead. And part of Geraldine's story is how she gets away with murder, and how what has been described about the way Geraldine gets away with it is that, for example, earlier critics like Mary Greer have said that the ending of the novel really transgresses all the literary conventions of the day that I was alluding to earlier, because Lady Geraldine, who is described as being, a new woman with advanced attitudes and so on, she gets away with the murder, but also she gets away with having these advanced attitudes and very Ibsenish and so on. And she isn't punished by society, but she gets away with it because another man, the friend of the family, actually says, I'll help you out and I'll help you disguise the murder for what you've done, and we'll make out that, in fact, he killed himself. So there's this duplicity going on again. It does show that Farr is quite radical in allowing Geraldine to avoid, what would certainly be a death sentence at the end. And it's quite socially brave. But she also shows us that Geraldine still remains dogged by the burden of secrecy to cover it up. And she attributes this, Geraldine, to character traits she has inherited from her late father. And what the picture that Farr shows us of Lord Kirkdale, the Marquis, the father, is that he is an exploitative, violent, abusive character who has manipulated and led his wife a merry dance all her life. There's hints of domestic violence. There is either, by the analogy that Farr draws with the Shelley play, which is based on an incestuous rape by the father, the Cenci himself, on his daughter, Beatrice. By analogy, we are led to understand that Kirkdale and his daughter Geraldine, who was the only one of his family who ever showed any attention to, is possibly also in a grotesquely exploitative relationship of herself. So there's this really difficult and transgressive angle to this novel, which has really been overlooked in past discussions of it, I think. And a lot of previous critics have made the comment, which is certainly substantiated by the text of the novel itself, that, it's a joke. It's a very throwaway analysis of family life. It is just like, sort of drawing room comedy kind of approach. But actually, I think that if it is a joke, it's actually a very dark one. And Farr is saying, this is it. And on the other side of it, what Farr is showing us here, through the character of Grace Lovell, who herself enters into a kind of awakening through literature, which is what I absolutely love. Because at one point in the novel, when she is in a library and she's reading a book, she just pulls a book at random from the library shelves. And I read this and I think, are we talking about bibliomancy here? Because the first book that she pulls down is Shelley's Cenci, with the story of Beatrice in it. And all of this undertow of the novel is present there. And Farr herself played that part in a private production of the play. So she knows what is the deep and dark themes and the expressive language that Shelley is using. And she uses this moment for Grace Lovell to engage with what she understands as a spirit emerging and entering her body, which is very much drawn from Farr's own experience of initiation rituals and so forth within the Golden Dawn. It's described in very similar ways to some of the transformational rituals that she was engaged with and that she taught, that she wrote on. And so we have Grace Lovell herself suddenly reading this play and enunciating the words and suddenly aware of the fact that this spirit has descended, and she is getting to know that she can change her life. She can build this inner fortress so that she won't be exploited any longer by the likes of George Travers or any other man. And she is effectively transformed, and she realizes then that she joins this kind of, Farr uses the sort of phrases like, kind of adept class of elite actors and so on. And you can see, she knows very well of what she's writing Farr in this particular piece. And she is encouraging women to be able to draw on this current themselves. And we have the whole kind of over the spirit behind Farr's work is Isis, who was her matron spirit herself within the Golden Dawn. And this is the way I was reading this passage was very much about how the spirit descending was the Isian current, Isis itself, the great mother goddess of all who's protecting. So it's a very powerful analysis that it touches on so many different themes of how toxic establishment marriage is. Because Farr writes in other circumstances, in her journalism and so on, at great length about how marriage is no good for women and how sex relations between men and women need to be reformed, and so that There's more, women have a freer choice and they shouldn't be tied to a man who is no good for them. And things like practical things like divorce should be made much easier, and we should be able to choose the father of our children and have relationships or not to have relationships and to be independent. And this is one of the major sort of impelling forces of her feminism and also her magic, the way of becoming independent through occultism. Very, very strong. And that was kind of the major message that she has, I think, for today.
It's very intriguing. The private writings that you just mentioned that she wrote in her journals and letters, were these also ideas that she was also writing in her fiction?
Yes. Okay. Yes, indeed. Okay. You can trace quite a lot. Having read some of her archival documents, had the privilege of seeing some of them, you can see how Farr is engaged with channeling practice, automatic writing, and she appears to be getting information from other sources whilst she's in this state. And a lot of it ends up in her work. There are scenes where she's meditating or having a vision, sort of at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she's having a conversation with a disembodied communicator, and who is imparting to her information which she appears not to know from other sources. And they're talking about the feather of Mart, the difference between that and the feather of Shu, and all of these mystical kind of associations emerge. And she gets channeled drawings of symbols and transliterations of other languages and so on. And there's a great deal of it in one particular section where it appears that she's receiving information, which then appears in, I think it is the Shrine of the Golden Hawk, at the climax of this, when the priest is sort of saying, no, the Golden Hawk will overcome you, he'll be killed, etc., etc. And the priestess stands firm and actually says, I've overcome the difficulty, as it were. In the archive, it appears that she is receiving information or images or suggestions and influences that actually you can trace in her work.
Interesting.
And it's very, very interesting because obviously, I would not otherwise take anything away from Florence Farr's scholarship of the time, because she was sort of self-taught in the British Museum and doing all the research from the original things that were being discovered then, and the translations of documents that were being done firsthand by herself and her other friends. So, she's actively researching a lot of arcane information and esoteric knowledge. But there is this really interesting and quite honestly not unexpected, given her intense training, abilities that she's developed to such a high standard. But there's this really intriguing indication that a lot of it is coming from elsewhere and helping her to develop her own imagination. Magical imagination is really helping it. So when she is kind of proposing that through literature, a woman can trigger, if we will, the descent of a spirit that will help her and to develop herself, whether it's psychologically or whether it's magically or however we interpret this, to achieve her own independence in the face of some highly manipulative and restrictive circumstances, then I think we can see that these things all are of a piece with Florence's work and thinking and how it's revealed. As we looked into the Golden Dawn, we know that various officers and people like Samuel Mathers and so on have said, well, a lot of the rituals we receive from spiritual sources. And, when you think, gosh, the way in which they actually appear to have derived the information, very long, very tedious, very letter by letter through various kind of divinatory practices and so on, and dowsing and clairvoyance and all of this, and spirit guides, just to sort of put it in a more broad brush terminology. I think it would be highly surprising if Florence didn't have this kind of help or assistance or way that sparks her imagination when she's writing. So I call her kind of work the literary alchemy. Is, it's like bringing together kind of literary responses, as we all do as readers, but also she's got this highly developed sense of our esoteric training. She understands about things such as correspondences of different and disparate kind of elements in nature, and then different kind of thoughts and processes and philosophies and figures and gods and spirits and everything brought together to create a kind of magical spiritual power out of this very thing. And she's bringing all that into literature. And I just see this whole thing as like a literary alchemy that she's creating. And from other things that she's writing about the study of alchemy and critical works on others. Robert Flood, the 18th century alchemist, she writes some notes about that. But she's also kind of talking about alchemical close reading. There's this whole passage where she's saying that by reading very closely the text, you'll extract different meanings from it. And she doesn't just mean, like when we read a novel or a thriller or something, we're all reading it on several different levels all the time, aren't we? We can't stop that. But there's also this sense of kind of symbolic, alchemical stuff that if you really give yourself up to this text, something else will happen. Because it's not for nothing that these symbols are in place and put in our brains so that we would be open to a different kind of influence.
Right.
She's a very rich writer, I find. And I hope that by some of what I have been doing, we'll be able to kind of talk about it in such a way that we can understand that there's other layers to what she's doing. It's not just a joke.
Yeah,
It's much more serious. There's transformation of the individual and the sort of elevation of the individual. The Golden Dawn always said that one of their aims is to become more than human, walk with the gods. And she has this throughout her work about really transformation of individuals and to be the best you can be, as it were. But she writes in the sort of introduction to her other later novel, The Solemnization of Jacqueline, and she says, and I'm paraphrasing this really, she says, I see that the greatest work is solemnization or transformation, and some see it under the mask of levity. So she's saying basically, you can have something as a joke and it can be light-hearted. And I might write like this. I might show you something in a drawing room, but actually underneath it all, there's this serious purpose. So pay attention.
Right. I see.
And, kind of pay attention and look and listen what we're talking about. That's one of the great sort of occult kind of dictums, really, if you want. Isn't it?
Correct. Yeah.
It's stranger than you think. Just pay attention and you'll get something more from it. And I think, it's very, to me, she's doing this through all her work. And it's simply because she's such a complex person.
Yeah, I see. A few more questions popped into my head. How was her work received, and who was reading her work? Was it just within her own esoteric circle, or was she just writing for everyone?
She was actually writing for everyone. And I think this is something that perhaps yet hasn't always come across, because Florence is really an astute marketer. There's a letter, or at least half a letter, in the archive that I read, and she's writing to John Watkins, she's a publisher. She's saying, look, how's my book going? I just think we should get this out to this person. It's being well received. I know people are talking about it. So what are you going to do about getting the next edition out? And she's really sort of saying, basically she's saying, look, for heaven's sake, why aren't you getting it in the bookshops, and why aren't we on the railway station platforms and all that sort of thing? You can imagine. She takes a lot of attention to how well her work is received. There are some reviews of her work in various sort of periodicals, or the PR puff pieces they'd be today about them. And some of them, you can see that they're the publisher spinning something, perhaps, to get the best response. But then there are comments on the backs of some of the early editions. And is it Rebecca West writing in, I think it's one of the I think it's Time and Tide, or one of the sort of women's suffragette papers later on, where she's actually talking about the solemnisation of Jacqueline, and she's referring to, Miss Farr has produced another interesting book kind of thing about relationships and so on. You're thinking, well, gosh, someone who's really well known in that time is writing and not saying it's awful. They're not slating it. They're saying it's really an interesting book and it's here and everyone should read it kind of thing. So I think she didn't have huge print runs from what I can gather. But I think some people did think that it was either not good literature or they didn't get the point of it or that it was just strange. But I think from some of the responses that you see and some of the kind of reviews of it, they're open to the fact that, this is an interesting novel by an interesting woman and there's some really interesting ideas. Because people did talk about, theosophical things. And when her plays were produced, The Shrine of the Golden Hawk and The Beloved of Hathor, the Tatler, for example, wrote about new theosophical play opens in London. And, it caught the public imagination to this model, as it does today when you see it, produced and people wearing Egyptian headdresses and all of this sort of thing. People were intrigued by it. And of course, Florence herself was well known as part of artistic society and drama, and she was known as an actor on the London scene. And she would have been someone who would have been not necessarily a household name in every single drawing room, but in a hell of a lot of them, she certainly was. Right. In a very approving way. So she wrote for everyone. I mean, this is the whole point of it.
Yeah.
One of the things, of course, that a lot of the work, when you look at the purpose of organisations, specifically the Golden Dawn, yes, the work was transform yourself and then go out into society and transform it. And by your influence, we will, raise society, we will make changes, and we will see the evolution of society in a way that uplifts us all. And so many of the people who were involved in the Golden Dawn actually were working artistically or through science or literature or however, embroidery even, to sort of disseminate some of the ideas and disseminate this kind of current of positive magical change. Yeah. And I think, this is certainly what we can glean from Florence's own work, and the fact that as an independent woman of limited means, she wanted to make sure her publisher got her some cash. Thank you very much. Well, who wouldn't,
Wonderful. That's great. Okay, so I'm looking at the time here, and I want to be respectful of your time. So we have 3 other wonderful ladies that we need to talk about. So let's move on to Mary Butts.
Yes.
She was no less interesting. She was a writer, a feminist, a student of Aleister Crowley at the Sicilian Abbey of Thelema, just to name a few things. What have you learned about Mary that you can share with us today?
Right, an awful lot, but I won't go into absolutely every last detail.
Of course. Okay.
Yeah, she wasn't so much a student of Aleister Crowley. This is quite interesting.
Oh, all right. Pardon me.
Yes, she's often described as that because Crowley is the name that so many people know. She was herself independently an occultist, a magic worker.
Okay.
She was born in a gentry family, well-to-do upper-middle-class family in Dorset, in rural England, in 1890. And her great-grandfather was Thomas Butts, who was the patron of William Blake. So it puts you in that kind of thing. In fact, Thomas Butts was the person who interrupted William Blake and his wife, allegedly. So the story is, when they were naked in their garden, and Thomas Butts goes, oh, my goodness. And Blake says, oh, it's just Adam and Eve, which I just think is the most fabulous story from your great-granddad. However, so in Mary Butts's home, they had a lot of original William Blake work, because there was no one collecting or anything in that century time. So that's just a small detail. Now, Mary Butts basically grew up influenced by her father, who was much, much older than her mother. There's a sort of, generational difference almost. Okay. Her father introduced her to classical education, Greek and Roman, so but particularly Greek, and the concepts of things like the daemons and spirits and the whole panoply of kind of the gods before the gods kind of thing, not so much Zeus, but these demonic spirits of the land were very, very real to Mary as a child. She saw goblins and elves and things in her garden. She had all these experiences of magic. And when she was a teenager, she went on to a local hill fort, Standing Stones up there in, I think it's Badbury Rings in Dorset. And she had an initiatory experience, like the spirit descended like on Grace Lovell. So we infer that it did on Mary as well. And she basically said, I knew something had emerged in me. And then she went away and changed her life. And she then started studying more of sort of occultism by herself. Okay. So when she went to London, and she was one of those, young women of the sort of First World War, Post-World War, that sort of period, the teens and 20s, she knew everyone. Absolutely. She did the whole thing. Some people only ever remember her as a red-headed scenester who went out and got drunk and all the rest of it. But the thing is, she would go out and have a lot of partying and all this, but then she'd go home at sort of like midnight or 1 a.m. and then write for the rest of the night because her work was so important to her. But she met Crowley, and she was introduced to him by Nina Hamnet, the artist, who, again, knew everybody. And I think there was a kind of a meeting of minds to this degree, because Crowley, on the one hand, he very much appreciated her knowledge and tried to, said, come and study with me and all this. And she was saying, actually, well, maybe I do want to, maybe I don't. And in her journals, she's quite sort of, he's not the be all and end all. And she wouldn't have a relationship with him, So, later on, Crowley's really quite unpleasant in a vastly horrible way about her personally, and the way he describes her in Diary of a Drug Fiend and things like that is really horrible. But he also really, really respects her knowledge, and he invites her to sort of do some kind of critique and reading of his magnum opus while he's still writing it. And she suggests kind of theme after theme, and why don't you write about this, and why don't you write about that, and you must make sure that you put this in. And he says, I was very grateful to her when they were in Sicily and working together on this, that she did so much work to help really develop my thinking and my work. So I've always been of the opinion that she was at least as knowledgeable in magic as Crowley. But what she didn't do was she didn't approve of the way in which he did it, in terms of the way in which she observed his relationship with the members of his inner circle, particularly the women. And she identified to her own satisfaction that, there was kind of manipulation going on, and there was, these women were all taking loads of drugs and they weren't making informed choices and various other things. And also she was quite outraged by the fact, she said, well, this could be a university, Alistair, we could really make it something fantastic if only you'd put some toilets in, and if only you'd make it really good. So it's this kind of thing she's saying, and she definitely disapproved of how she describes the fact that children were present when naked rituals and sex magic was being practiced. Now, she's writing that, she is observing it, and that's one of the things that she is critical of. And it does result in the end, Crowley is very unpleasant about her in print and so on. But I think at the core of it, there's this understanding between the two of them that they do have respect for the magical knowledge. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in when I was working on her novel, Armed with Madness, which is essentially the story of a group of bohemian young artist people, men and women, but particularly one woman, a young woman called Scylla, who is like the kind of head of the household of this group of young men who are artists and ex-war veterans and so on, all trying to make sense of, well, after the First World War, what do? We don't want to live one of these awful establishment marriages. We don't want to be the way we've been. How do we reform ourselves? And so they're all in this kind of magical commune in a sort of way that perhaps she may have seen in person. And essentially, without being incredibly detailed here, Armed with Madness is a modern retelling of the Grail myth.
Okay.
And because one of the young men finds a chalice, well, an object, it's only described as an object, in a well, and they hook it out with a spear. So you've got this sort of, chalice and spear, you've got this sort of phallic imagery coming out right at the beginning of this novel. And they say, oh, it's a chalice. What is this? What is this thing? And through the novel, the cup or the chalice or the plate or the dish or whatever, it's described in a very kind of protean unfixed way. So we've got this kind of magical sense. At one point, one of the characters says, oh, it's made of starlight, and it's like, so there's this really kind of dreamy, kind of unfixed and malleable kind of thing about this object, whose purpose is to completely disrupt the society that it emerges into and transform each of the characters who in their relationship to it. And it's a very, very interesting portrayal and use of this narrative, which, of course, for British people in particular, and particularly at this time, is a very, very important national myth. But it's highly significant. And Mary Butts herself, when she was a child being brought up by her father, who very erudite, very learned, she was introduced to all of the Victorian interpretations of the Grail myth. And she said that the King Arthur legends, and she writes in the 30s, the most important thing, the only thing that mattered, I realised when I was a child about the King Arthur, was the Holy Grail. That was it. That's the only magical thing that really, really mattered. And when I was researching it, there are some very interesting kind of crossovers or resonances and kind of understandings that I discern between Butts's use of the Grail and Crowley's description of the cup in Magic and Theory of Practice. And there are so many interesting interplays. I don't think that she sort of forgot that. And I think that this is an element of whereby is evidence of how they were both thinking along the same lines about the potency of this object and about how one could use it. And there are even, in her later novel, there are points at which her understanding of the Grail, that she obviously developed at the same time or in parallel with Crowley, because they say, they are from the same kind of era, as it were. The use of the Grail and the use of the bell and other magical implements occur in the novel at specific times, and it triggers the same kind of sort of transformative kind of spiritual awakening that in the kind of obvious occult magic practice would be expected as a result of the ritual. And here we have it in the kind of literary format. And it adds another layer of depth and richness to, Mary Butts's high modernist text. Her style of fiction is pretty, well, people go, highbrow, don't make a sense of it. But actually, if you stick with it, you can really enjoy it. It isn't impenetrable. But it takes us into the atmosphere of the novel is as magical itself as the kind of use of a kind of magical intent and ritual. It sort of takes you into a different sphere.